This is what the modern computer's great-grandfather ENIAC looked like. It was introduced to the general public in 1946, a 30-ton giant. It was 26 meters long and as tall as a two-story building. Despite its huge size, its computing power was inferior to the smallest modern phones, all because ENIAC was a brainless computer. Or rather, microprocessorless is a more accurate word when speaking of the machine. By creating a microprocessor, the Intel founders became gods of the electronic world. Their invention was so life-changing that even half a century later, their technology is still used to produce modern microprocessors. So, why did the once monopolists lose their leading position to competitors, and today have to play catch-up? How did a story of betrayal create Intel together with Silicon Valley? Knowledge is power. 50 years ago, few people could imagine that a computer could be made available to the public, let alone its presence in every home. Only the military and a limited circle of scientists used to have access to computers, or rather their ancestors, electronic computing machines, which were really huge mechanisms. Everything changed when the microprocessor was invented, the processor that is the device's brain. Our brain consists of billions of neurons, which it uses to receive and process information from various organs. The processor is the same thing, but with transistors instead of neurons. The transistor is quite a primitive device, something like an electronic gate. For example, our computer is connected to the net but is turned off. The gate is closed and doesn't let the current pass. But as soon as we press the start button, thousands of gates open, the current passes, and the computer turns on. Intel's history began long before its foundation, namely with the invention of the first transistor and the person who tried but failed to create it, William Shockley. The one behind it. William Shockley is the most criticized Nobel Prize winner, a brilliant scientist who deliberately ruined his reputation. But first things first. At the age of 26, Shockley received his PhD after defending his doctoral thesis in solid-state physics at MIT in 1936. Shockley had an outstanding scientist as his research advisor, Philip Morse, the father of operations research in the USA. It was he who had introduced Shockley to his future boss, Marvin Kelly. Imagine it's 1936. The country is in the middle of crisis, universities have no money, and a young, talented scientist doesn't know where to go. And here comes Marvin Kelly, who invited William Shockley to his Bell Research Lab in New York. This AT&T lab was founded in 1925 to unite scientists specializing in various fields. Kelly believed that for this team to succeed, it needed a leader, a genius in his field, and he thought young Shockley was the kind of person he wanted. The very first year of William's work resulted in 8 articles and an invention, a device for focusing rays in a cathode ray tube. One of the articles, dated in 1938, would become a life-changing theoretical work, Currents to Conductors Induced by a Moving Point Charge. A conference on theoretical physics took place in Washington in 1939, and there Niels Bohr announced his discovery of uranium fission. After the nuclear fission had been reported, Marvin Kelly instructed William to think of practical use of atomic energy. William's thinking turned out to be very prolific. 2 months later, he presented his concept of a working nuclear power plant based on the idea of slowing down neutrons. But what's more interesting, he voiced the idea of creating an atomic bomb. The Bell Laboratory hastened to patent all these inventions, but the US government unobtrusively and repeatedly asked them to avoid any nuclear research. And Shockley's report was kept secret, even from the participants of the US nuclear project. Shockley was carefully watched from above, and for a reason. During the war, Philip Morse recruited his former student, and from that time Shockley started working on military tasks. But unlike most scientists, he had nothing to do with developing radars, but created strategies. The bombing strategy and the strategy of searching for enemy submarines. Notably, his work on the latter task could end badly for Shockley himself. He drew attention to the fact that the U.S. radio operators' calculations of positions of the German submarines were too accurate, which wasn't even theoretically possible. Luckily, he was told to ignore the fact before it was too late. He almost revealed the main military secret that the German radio operators' secret codes had already been cracked. The war was coming to an end, and the last thing Shockley did for his country was a report on the strategy of the war with Japan. He justified the need to use nuclear weapons in July 1945, thus indirectly promoting the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Where it all happened. Without a single idle day after the war, Shockley returned to civilian work at his Bell Lab. He rounded up a scientific group that started trying to create a transistor. We already know what it is, a device that can control electric current. Shockley's research took too long. Even after 2 years, he still hadn't achieved success. At the same time, independently and in secret from William, his colleagues Walter Brattain and John Bardeen took a different direction and succeeded. They presented a working transistor to the world in 1947. Shockley felt mortally offended, but the point was that his colleagues managed to invent a transistor by accident, by a trivial mistake. If you aren't a physicist, you can hardly understand Walter Brattain's omission, but still, when experimenting with 2-needle electrodes, he simply confused the polarity of the applied voltage and unexpectedly received a stable signal amplification. This split the colleagues, but Shockley kept working on semiconductors, and a couple of months later, he managed to improve his colleague's invention by creating a bipolar transistor, for which he would win the Nobel Prize. The atmosphere in the lab grew tenser every year. Shockley's unbearable character, along with the previous offense, interfered with fruitful cooperation. Shockley left the Bell Lab after finally breaking up with his colleagues in '56 and opened his own company, Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory. Shockley failed to lure his former colleagues. Indeed, everyone admitted that he was a brilliant engineer, but there were always human relations to think about as well. William attracted young professionals who had just graduated from American universities, whom he believed to be the best specialists in electronics. The future founders of Intel also were among these youth. Gordon Moore, who received his PhD in chemistry and physics from the California Institute of Technology, Pasadena, was working in the university's lab. But soon he decided that the private industry was more promising. Besides, he got very interested in a recently invented transistor. So after learning the news that one of its creators was starting his own company and looking for employees, he hastened to respond to a job opening. Just then, his future boss, Robert Noyce, received his PhD in solid-state physics from MIT. Because as a student he had heard a lot about William Shockley, he thought the prospect of working with the university legend was very tempting. Shockley did really manage to round up a team of geniuses, but his lab hardly worked for 2 years. And again, his character was to blame. He often lost his temper and was rude to his subordinates. It's quite possible that he was like this since he was born. According to his father's records, even in his infancy, he bit everyone, including his parents, on the cheek. William's father once wrote, "It's strange, but he hasn't broken anything today." At some point, Shockley got an idea that he had a pest among his employees and introduced an obligatory lie detector test. The atmosphere of total control had a negative effect on the team's productivity, and Shockley's refusal to keep researching silicon and semiconductors, which his team members insisted on, was the last straw. A year after Shockley's Semiconductor Laboratory's foundation, 8 key employees left the company. For this, William called them traitors, and they would forever go down in history as the traitorous 8, who promoted the creation of Silicon Valley. Eventually, Shockley completely lost interest in science and business. Having seriously gotten into eugenics, he started a public campaign on degeneration of the American race, which would finally bury his reputation as a scientist. Shockley's end was symbolic. After leaving his wife suffering from cancer, he eventually contracted cancer himself. Alas, but a high intellect doesn't always mean a big heart. Free floating. The traitorous 8 were Julius Blank, Victor Greenwich, Gene Herney, Gene Kleiner, Jay Last, Sheldon Roberts, and the future founders of Intel, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore. The young specialists wanted to start their own company, or rather, they wanted to work together since they had become close friends when working for Shockley Laboratory. From the memoirs of Jay Last, one of the 8, quote, "One evening we met at the house of Vic Greenwich, another member of the traitorous 8, to talk about our next move. We were all downhearted, sitting in this dark paneled room. We would get jobs easily, but we liked working together. That night, we made the decision to find some way that we could work as a group. But we were asking, how can we get a company to hire a group of 8 people?" Unquote. Starting their company looked easier than getting a job with someone else as a whole group. But there was a problem. They had no money. So they started looking for investors and found a venture capitalist and financier, Arthur Rock, a man who would play a crucial role in starting Intel. Quote, "If these 8 people hadn't stuck together and kept working, there might not have been a Silicon Valley." Arthur introduced the traders to Sherman Mills Fairchild, who then already owned a number of companies with a wide business scope, ranging from creating cameras to designing aircrafts. Fairchild agreed to finance the young specialist startup and invested $1.5 million in their business. The only condition was that he reserved the right to buy out the engineer's business for twice as much as the initially invested funds. The company's authorized capital was divided into 1,325 shares, with 800 being equally divided between the members of the 8, 225 taken by Hayden Stone, and another 300 remained as a reserve. The very next year, Sherman exercised his right to buy out the shares, thus starting Fairchild Semiconductor, a subsidiary of Fairchild Camera and Instrument. That very year, Gene Herney came up with the idea to cover transistors with a layer of silicon oxide to protect them from dirt, dust, and other contaminants, which allowed Robert Noyce to improve the device, inventing a silicon integrated circuit. While Fairchild used to produce transistors on large plates, cut out the components and interconnect them with wires, Noyce's invention allowed to sink metal joints into the plate, thus significantly reducing the size and creating a viable chip. Nowadays, Noyce's model is still used in modern chips. Silicon Valley. In the 1960s, Fairchild became one of the leading producers of operational amplifiers and other analog integrated circuits. Fairchild Camera and Instrument couldn't ignore its subsidiary's success. Eager to boost the profits, they began to interfere in the engineer's business, limiting their freedom with over-bureaucracy and control, which triggered controversies. As a result, half of the 8 immediately left the company. But in fact, the conflict had been brewing for a long time, from the very start of the 8's co-working. Initially, Gordon Moore, Gene Herney, and Jay Last headed 3 groups of specialists who worked on different types of transistors. But Gordon Moore's NPN transistors were the most successful, and his colleagues' research turned out to be kind of useless. Due to this, although having no formal authority, Moore and his supporter, Robert Noyce, became the first among equals, and often ignored their colleagues' opinions and devalued their contributions to the common business. And as Jay Last said, when Sherman exercised his right and bought out the 8's shares, they ceased to be a team, turning into a group of employees. In 1960, Last and Herney left Fairchild and headed to Amelco Microelectronic Company, with Kleiner and Roberts also joining. Blank, Greenwich, Moore, and Noyce remained, and thus they became the 8 split into 2 fours. Soon Noyce was appointed CEO, and Moore became the head of the Research and Development Department. In 1963, a doctor of science, Andrew Grove, the future 3rd co-founder of Intel, and perhaps the most important person in the company's history, got a job with the company. At the interview, he was introduced to Gordon Moore. They immediately found common ground, and soon Grove would become Moore's confidant. Gordon Moore is a brilliant engineer, but not a manager, who didn't want to deal with managerial tasks, and usually failed to defend his point of view. Grove, on the contrary, was proactive and willing to take on responsibility, self-studied management, and in fact, it was he who headed the Research and Development Department. Holding the CEO position, Robert Noyce planned to get a share in the parent company by receiving a part of its stocks. But when he realized that he wouldn't get what he wanted, he decided to leave the company, luring his friend Gordon Moore into leaving with him. And Andrew Grove followed Moore. Thus, almost the entire traitorous eight had left Fairchild by 1970. Those who left founded their own semiconductor companies in Silicon Valley, thereby creating the Valley. Such companies as Intel, AMD, Altera, LSI Logic, and SanDisk were founded at this time. As you can see, the Valley got its name after the innovative introduction of silicon, a mineral used to produce semiconductors. The term Silicon Valley was first used by journalist Don Heffler in his series of articles on January 11, 1971. By the 1970s, Silicon Valley was already a blooming place where human hands were creating the future. Its territory became home to all of the largest high-tech corporations. Usually, most of these corporations' employees graduated from Stanford. The fact is that the university management took a wise decision in 1951. They offered land plots at Stanford to technology companies. Subsequently, university students could get jobs at large corporations, implementing their ideas there or gaining experience and developing their own projects. Even before this Silicon story, HP, Eastman Kodak, and General Electric moved to Stanford. You can find the history of the latter company on our channel. Foundation of Intel, Integrated Electronics. So, it was 1968. Having a tremendous amount of knowledge but no money, Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce decided to start their own company. Being aware of all the pitfalls, they remembered Arthur Rock, the man who had previously helped them find an investor. Quote, Gordon Moore came to me without a business plan. He and his companions brought a page with text where they wrote that they would produce silicon devices. There were a lot of mistakes, and I think Gordon typed it himself. The document wasn't impressive, but very nice. I asked, how much money do you need? They answered, $2.5 million. And what will be my share? A half. The next day, I found the money. After receiving the funds, Gordon Moore, Robert Noyce, and Andrew Grove founded Intel in 1968. However, it should be mentioned that Noyce and Moore did not treat Grove as a full-fledged co-founder. For example, when thinking of a future company's name, their first idea was NM Electronics. N and M are the first letters of their surnames. As you can see, the letter G is missing. Moreover, Arthur Rock, who got the position of the chairman of the board of directors, gave no shares to Grove at all. Despite being treated like this, Grove didn't feel offended. He worked hard, took the production manager position, and effectively organized the workflow, as well as maintained discipline, which freedom-loving engineers lack. In fact, he was the only one engaged in management. It was his integrity that allowed them to stick to Moore's Law. According to Moore's Law, the number of transistors on the integrated circuit must be doubled every 1.5 or 2 years. Grove introduced a system of goals for each employee, regardless of his level, which allowed him to evaluate their performance. Grove classified employees by their performance, ranking them as the best, exceeds expectations, meets expectations, and doesn't meet expectations. This evaluation system was clear to every employee of the company. The employees were well aware of how Grove evaluated their recent achievements. Those who failed to meet his expectations, he gave time to fix the problem. If the employee couldn't do it in 90 days, he was fired. At the same time, Grove opposed strict subordination and hierarchy. He allowed and welcomed ordinary employees to criticize him. By the way, making friends with the manager couldn't save an underperforming employee from being fired. Grove's colleagues joked that he would fire his mother if she interfered with the company's growth, which Grove didn't deny. The newborn company set a specific goal: to create a high-quality and affordable semiconductor memory chip. Nothing like this had ever been created before due to the high cost of a silicon chip-powered storage device. The cost of a semiconductor storage reached $1 per bit, while magnetic core storage devices cost only about a cent per bit. Robert Noyce used to say, "There was only one thing we needed to do: to cut the cost by 100 times and thereby conquer the market." That's what we generally were doing. The first success. In 1970, Intel released a 1 kilobit memory chip. significantly exceeding the capacity of the chips available at the time. 1 kilobit is 1,024 bits. 1 byte consists of 8 bits. That is, the chip could store only 128 bytes of information, which is insignificant by modern standards. The chip known as the Dynamic Random Access Memory Device 1103 was created hastily. The crisis whipped the company. The device hadn't passed the tests properly. However, the company's CEO, Noyce, signed an agreement with Microsystems International. Microsystems paid $1.5 million for the right to become the second supplier of the DRAM 1103 and promised a rebate. Grove was furious about Noyce's act since no one asked his opinion as the product manager. Grove claimed that the chip had flaws and he needed the full staff of specialists to promptly eliminate them. He was ignored, but the production of Intel's DRAM 1103 proved successful, and it became the world's best-selling semiconductor device by the end of the following year. As soon as the following year, the 4004 microprocessor was invented, which became a life-changer in the computer industry. Notably, it was created almost by chance. A Japanese company called Busicom contacted Intel asking to develop a chipset for a family of high-performing programmable calculators. The calculator's original configuration required at least 12 chips of various types. Intel's engineer, Ted Hoff, rejected this concept and developed a single-chip logic device instead. The device's potential was underestimated. The area of application of the chip wasn't limited to calculators. In fact, this structure had almost unlimited scope of use. When engineers at Intel realized it, they were gripped by panic because they had transferred all the rights to the invention to their Japanese colleagues. So they hurried to buy these rights back and were lucky. Busicom was struggling with financial problems. Besides, the Japanese company didn't fully realize the potential of this device, so they agreed to the deal. An ally. In 1979, Intel released their famous microprocessor 8088, which was positioned as the beginning of a new era. But half a year later, Motorola's 68000 microprocessor appeared, which outperformed Intel in efficiency and sales. To fight the competitor, Intel launched a large-scale marketing campaign and took a risky step. Intel used to keep its developments totally secret until they were released. But since that time, they decided to publish a catalog telling customers about promising inventions and opportunities they would provide. This approach proved successful. In no time, the company managed to regain its market leadership. In addition to marketing, cooperation with giants such as IBM helped them to fight their competitors. In the 1980s, IBM was a titan of the computer world, which was solving the task of producing all the components on its own to quash the emerging threat to their business from Steve Jobs and his new computer. IBM was forced to develop its PC, but failed to make their own microprocessor the new machine required, and so they turned to Intel for help. Soon, the first IBM personal computer was released. Their computer triggered the rapid growth of the industry. IBM relied on Intel for microprocessor production and on Microsoft for their operating system. Intel microprocessors quickly became the standard of the computer industry. Operating system producers such as Windows and hardware manufacturers such as IBM developed their products with an eye on Intel. By the way, the only exception was Apple, since Steve Jobs bought microprocessors from Motorola. So, the war with competitors seemed to have been won. However, IBM realized that its position was critical, or rather it was completely dependent on Intel. Therefore, IBM established cooperation with AMD to cover their bases. This cooperation infuriated Grove, whom Robert Noyce had handed over his position of Intel's CEO a few years earlier. AMD's CEO was Jerry Sanders, a man who learned from Noyce, and it was thanks to Noyce that AMD received a license to produce clones of Intel's microprocessors. In the 1960s, Jerry Sanders worked as the global marketing manager at Fairchild Semiconductor, where he met Noyce. Following the example of the traitorous 8, Jerry and his 7 colleagues left Fairchild and founded AMD in 1969. Over the next 12 years, AMD mainly worked as a secondary resource for Intel, simply manufacturing Intel's products with Noyce's permission. And the time had come when Intel's new CEO couldn't put up with this situation. Grove managed to achieve a ban on cloning his equipment, but AMD kept doing so despite his ban. This led to years of legal proceedings, which we'll touch upon a bit later. One step back and two steps forward. Quote, "A company must have long tentacles for an all-around market research and creation of numerous contact points with consumers. However, despite the random character of such interaction, a company must be very disciplined." In his Only the Paranoid Survive, Grove will touch upon the strategy of overcoming the crisis. Later, many other large companies will use his methodology. Grove put forward the strategic turning point concept, a period when external pressure is so strong that it causes the need for fundamental changes, both within the company and throughout the industry. He said that the banking sector was undergoing similar processes when ATMs replaced operators, and in the retail sector when Walmart wiped out a lot of small family shops. Intel also had its strategic turning point. In the early 1980s, Japanese competitors were a major threat to Intel's core business, memory chip production. However, Grove didn't take them seriously since it was generally believed that all Japanese companies could do was to copy, not create. However, he was wrong, deeply wrong. He had no idea how fast Japanese companies were developing, how much they invested in research, and how successfully they cooperated with contractors to boost performance. In the early 1980s, the output of high-quality products from the Japanese memory chip sector was 80% compared to 50% in the US. When the US economy declined, higher productivity made it possible for Japanese companies to cut their prices, thus increasing their market presence and initiating a trade war of cheap exports to the US. That's why Grove decided to switch Intel's business from manufacturing memory chips to producing microprocessors. For this, he fired 8,000 people and spent over $100 million on reorganization. On the surface, it might seem that producing memory chips and microprocessors was the same thing. However, these fields required completely different skills and approaches. Grove was forced to transform Intel and decide who to keep and who to fire, not to mention the fact that assembly lines were to be re-equipped or closed. He had to complete all this during the year of 1986. By the way, it was the first year in the company's history when it suffered material losses. Monopoly. So, it was 1986. PC sales were rapidly growing. IBM stood their ground. They needed another manufacturer as a safety net, and Grove, who jealously guarded the company's secrets, replied that Intel wouldn't attract another company, especially Jerry Sanders' AMD. Having developed an upgraded 8386 processor, Intel established cooperation with other young computer companies, such as Dell, Zenith, Compaq, and Tandy. Thus, Intel gave birth to powerful competitors for IBM, and a couple of months later, IBM changed its principles and agreed to cooperate with Intel without any safety nets and bought new processors from them. But it was too late. After just a few months of technological stagnation, IBM lost their leading position, and Intel became the industry's only supplier of microprocessors, except for Apple, who was loyal to Motorola. Quote, "This victory changed the rules of the game. From now on, Intel's microprocessors are the industry standard, which means that component manufacturers, from keyboards to software, must make their product compatible with ours." Andrew Grove. The company actually became a monopoly, and the fact that demand exceeded supply led to a shortage on the market. And it was up to Intel to decide who and when would receive microprocessors and at what price. However, it was not only IBM that was dissatisfied with the situation, but the US Department of Defense as well, which increased AMD's significance as an alternative manufacturer. According to the agreement of 1982, AMD held all the licenses to produce 8086, 8186, and 8286 processors. But the agreement was signed by Noyce, which Grove, as a new CEO, didn't want to put up with. The termination of the agreement resulted in a long and high-profile trial, which ended only in 1991 with AMD's victory. Intel paid the plaintiff $1 billion for its position, but this was just the beginning of the war between AMD and Intel. By law, the new 8386 processor wasn't covered by the agreement, but AMD copied it as well. They launched their AM386, and sold over 1 million copies by 1981. Their processor had different hardware, but the same microcode, and now it was Intel's turn to go to court. Despite the obvious copyright infringement, AMD managed to get the court on its side. The court stated that the agreement of 1982 hadn't been officially terminated, which meant that AMD had the right to copy the microcode of all Intel's processors. Analysts of the time attributed this to the fact that the US government benefited from AMD's victory, but there's no direct evidence. Despite their victory, AMD decided that it was their turn and filed a suit with the competition regulator in Northern California, accusing Intel of illegal actions aimed at maintaining its monopoly. In February '92, the court decided against Intel again and rewarded AMD $10 million and the right to free licensing of any Intel patents. Intel hastened to appeal the case. It all ended at the Supreme Court in 1994. At last, the Supreme Court of California decided that copying another manufacturer's code against its will didn't seem right, thus finally denying AMD the right to use Intel's microcodes. The battle was over with Intel's victory, but it was just the beginning of the real war. AMD didn't want to copy anymore. From that time forward, they would create. In 1995, they released the AMD K5 processor, which successfully competed with Intel Pentium. And the most important thing was that they had a completely different architecture. Overseas. But Intel didn't actually focus its entire attention on fighting against AMD. They had more important things to do, namely, to penetrate the international market. The 1990s gave birth to internet companies such as Yahoo, Amazon, eBay, and Google. All of them contributed to demand for Intel-based personal computers. But as you remember, Andrew Grove was a business paranoid who believed that a turning point would happen at any time, so one could never relax. In the early 90s, he started businesses in 6 foreign countries: Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, the Caribbean islands, Japan, and Israel. The decision to expand the business was the right one, since as soon as the early 1990s, Intel received more than half of its revenue from abroad. In 2000, they accounted for 63%, and in 2008 for 85% of the total revenue. Over 10 years, the total value of Intel shares had grown from $4 to $100 billion, and the company moved from the 200th position to the 38th in the Fortune list. The sales volume grew from $2 to $26 billion. The company doubled in size every 2 years. In a sense, it looked like its growth followed Moore's Law. On August 31, 2000, one of Intel's shares cost $78, and the entire company was estimated at about $500 billion. It was the most expensive production in the world. Its cost exceeded all the US car manufacturers put together. By the early 2000s, 80% of personal computers were powered by Intel microprocessors. The era is over. In 1998, Andrew Grove left the CEO position, but the company kept sticking tightly to his principles. Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, who had worked with Shockley Laboratories and then at Fairchild, didn't want to repeat their former employer's mistakes and thought the main problems were bureaucracy, over-control, and strict subordination. They were eager to develop a lighter management style so that everyone felt like more than just an employee. They kept in touch with their employees at informal weekly lunches and celebrated technological breakthroughs with exclusive champagne. The employees received Intel stock options as a bonus. However, when you have over 50,000 employees around the world, this technique isn't viable. In fact, Grove was the one responsible for management, and his colleagues were brilliant engineers, but sometimes failed to make rational decisions when it came to the issues related to running the business. Take Noyce's decision to help his old friend Jerry Sanders at the company's cost. By the way, after the management changed, relations between Intel and AMD got back on track, but not for long. In 2007, AMD accused Intel of violating the antitrust law. The reason was that Intel offered discounts to those PC manufacturers who bought processors from them alone. Besides, they paid for postponing or canceling AMD processor-based products, as well as deliberately selling their processors below cost if Intel happened to participate in a tender together with AMD. 2 years later, Intel and AMD settled all the antitrust and patent disputes and signed a 5-year cross-licensing agreement. However, the number of trials with Intel's participation didn't get smaller. The company repeatedly received claims from the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, the European Commission, as well as Japanese and South Korean regulators. In 2010, Intel still held the leading positions in the industry, but it was no longer a monopoly. Information technologies and communications are actually the most rapidly developing field, so competition ramps up faster here as well. Intel has got strong competitors such as Apple, Samsung, and TSMC. The latter is a current leader in the semiconductor segment. As for technologies, Intel has been one step ahead of its competitors for more than 40 years, but gradually it began to lose ground, unable to cope with either the required production volumes of its processors or the transition to modern technological processes. Missed the chance. As of 2019, despite the launch of the 10nm Ice Lame series, most Intel chips are still 14nm, while AMD has long mastered 7nm. The problems began early in 2017 when AMD released the first generation of its 14nm Zen architecture and began to aggressively capture the market by launching affordable processors, whose characteristics weren't inferior to Intel products. For example, at that time, the 8-core Intel i7-6900 cost around $1,100, and AMD responded with launching the Ryzen 7 1800X for $500. In 2018, Intel released its i9-9980XE for $2,000, but AMD responded with the 16-core Ryzen 9 3950X for just $750. This chip surpassed its competitor in clock rate and general performance, but cost almost 3 times cheaper. However, it should be noted that AMD chips may win by technical characteristics as well as by results demonstrated in chip performance testing programs. But at the same time, they lose to Intel chips when working on real tasks in various software. It's all about the fact that this software has been adapted to suit Intel chips. Another evidence of AMD's success is the rating of the world's top 10 most popular processors compiled by Amazon Web Store. According to their data, most buyers preferred processors with AMD's chips. At the Citi Global Tech Conference, Intel admitted that it was losing market share to AMD and promised to act more aggressively. They believe that recognizing the problem is the first step to solving it. Our time. Hardly did Intel recognize one problem in 2019 when a new one immediately appeared: COVID-19. However, the figures show that the coronavirus wasn't a problem for the company. In 2020, the company's sales amounted to $77 billion, which is 8% higher than a year earlier. Omdia analyst Ron Ellwanger said Intel's chip diversification strategy helped the company. Quote, Intel's performance in 2019 represents a triumph for the company's diversified business model. Once regarded as a PC-centric microprocessor supplier, Intel is now a diversified vendor of solutions ranging from logic chips to software to analytics. Andrew Grove's paranoia has borne fruit. One can never focus all the resources in one direction. There always must be a plan B, since no one knows when there will be a turning point. And while other companies are suffering from the consequences of the crisis, Intel is working on its 3nm central processor that they promised to show in 2024. Indeed, it will be TSMC that will produce chips because Intel has no equipment to produce them on. As of March 2023, there are only 2 companies in the world that have mastered 4nm production: Samsung and TSMC. But TSMC is much closer to switching to 3nm, so Intel decided on cooperating with them. However, Intel CEO Patrick Gelsinger claimed that they are working on their own 3nm line, not to be completely dependent on the Taiwanese company like AMD. Our video is nearly over, and we have a couple of questions for you. Do you think the US government really contributed to Intel losing its monopoly? How do you feel about monopolies? How do you feel about AMD's approach at the beginning of their career? Don't you think Intel mostly owes its success to Andrew Grove, and that the company truly missed such a manager after he left? You can read our team's opinions in the comments.